Hello, everybody, and welcome to a little bit of a different episode of Evan's News. So, I kind of want to try a little something something, and that is just uploading some audio files of me talking about the news. The reason I'm thinking about doing this is because I don't really have a good way to mount my camera for streaming. I still need to do that. Maybe even buying a new streaming camera, to be honest, getting some lighting, all these type of things that hopefully will eventually make it a little bit easier for me to stream. In the meantime, I'm thinking about doing this thing where every morning I wake up and I tell you guys the news from yesterday, kind of getting on today, and stream kind of at my convenience. It's a little bit hard for me to fit streaming into my schedule if I'm being completely honest. Um, it's easier for me to wake up early than it is for me to stay up late and stream. Um, so that's kind of what I'm thinking about doing. So this is going to be the first test run of this. This is going to be an audio only stream, or I suppose YouTube video. Still kind of unedited, my unfiltered thoughts. Maybe it's kind of a little bit more of a podcast format. It is just something that I'm thinking about doing. Um, so yeah, we will talk today. We got a couple of news stories that I want to talk about that are going on today. Get you guys kind of caught up on what is going on in the world of politics, in the world of the United States, and our continuing, um, and perhaps we're already there, descent into fascism. We're just going to give this a try. I'm going to upload it and see what you guys think about it. Um, and yeah, maybe I'll try and put a little bit more effort into making more of kind of a podcast format for this. Maybe with some sounds and all that kind of stuff. That's not just my unfiltered thoughts. Maybe I'll actually edit. But for now, let's get right into it. Welcome to Evan's News. It is currently 6:11 in the morning. Excuse me. I have just finished eating my breakfast. I have a cup of coffee with me. And I am ready to talk to you guys about the news. Now, hopefully we can do this every morning. It's a little bit easier for me to do. So I'll have a daily upload for you guys. You guys can just listen to this in the background while you do something. Um, yeah, let's get right into it. So there's two news stories that I really want to talk about today. There are so many news stories going on everywhere, but I'm going to try and focus on what's going on today. That's my goal, to focus on news stories that are currently happening, that are currently, for lack of a better term, in the news. That's the goal for today. So let's get right into it. Good morning, everybody. Or for whenever you're listening to this, welcome to Evan's News. So I'm sure you guys all remember back in 2020, the whole election fraud stuff, where, I mean, there was a whole insurrection about it. They tried to storm the Capitol and overturn an election because of, well, because A, Trump wanted to keep power. Fundamentally, that was what was going on. But the conspiracy theory was that there were voting fraud. All the ballot machines were bad. Um, People were committing voter fraud. Non-citizens were voting. Yada 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 yada. That was over 5 years ago now, which is insane. But that was what was going on. There was this idea that there was voter fraud going on. And what they did was, they tried to overturn the election. There was an insurrection. It was a crazy, crazy time. But anyway, they're still on the voter fraud thing. They have been, they have not given it up. And transparently, they don't really give a shit about voter fraud. They don't care about people coming in and voting, when they shouldn't. Back in the olden days, I don't know if you guys know this, but there was Tammany Hall in New York. um, political machines, and there was voter fraud back then. Quite a bit of it. You guys know the bit, where the bearded person goes and votes once, shaves their beard but leaves the mustache, votes twice, shaves the mustache, votes 3 times. I don't actually know if that happened that much. Um, but voter fraud has been a problem in the past. And also, simply put, voter fraud still obviously happens. There are usually well over 100 million votes that are cast. I'm sure some of those votes are suspect. I mean, just the numbers, that's just the way it works. But research shows that voter fraud is exceptionally rare. Um, Again, when over 100 million people vote, some people are going to commit voter fraud, even if it's exceptionally rare. 1 in 100 million is exceptionally rare. Um, but it's not really a big problem. It's not a problem to the point that it can sway an election. Obviously, when it happens, the people committing the voter fraud should be punished. But it is not something that happens a lot. Again, I want to reinforce that obviously voter fraud happens when over 100 million votes are cast. Not all of those votes are going to be perfect. It's just a numbers game at that point. But Republicans have been focused on voting. They want voter ID laws to stop non citizens from voting, even though A, voting in federal elections, at least, non citizens cannot vote and do not vote usually again. So sorry. When over 100 million votes are cast, it makes sense that some of those votes will be suspect. I'm sure there are non-citizens who slip through the cracks and vote. Just, just the numbers game. Again, it's just the numbers game. But not enough again to determine the outcome of any election. Um, but they've wanted voter ID laws. Um, yeah. Um, they basically want to make it harder to vote. And that is the point of a lot of these voter ID laws. I know a lot of countries have voter IDs, and like conceptually at least, a voter ID doesn't sound like the worst idea, right? You got to prove that you can vote. You got to prove that you're a citizen, so you have an ID to vote. On the surface, it doesn't sound that bad, right? Kind of reasonable. The issue is that voter ID laws, and especially the ones that are being pushed right now, do make it harder to vote for people. Um, like I said, cases of voter fraud are exceptionally rare in this country. Cases of non citizens voting are exceptionally rare in this country. Um, and yet, it's a sticking point for Republicans who it is in their best interest to disenfranchise people. Um, the reason being is because Republicans win elections through, I would argue, processes that do not favor majority rule in the sense of like a democratic process, right? In the sense of that. The most people, if you win the votes of the most people, you win an election. Republicans usually don't benefit off of that, at least in massive federal elections. Local elections, yes, like voting for the House, yes. There are districts or areas of the country that are majority Republican, and so the Republicans win there. But as a whole, as a country, Republicans are in the minority. Um, they usually are. For stuff like the Senate, for instance, the Senate very much favors Republicans because while there is not a Republican population majority, most states do tend to lean Republican. And because each state gets 2 senators in the Senate, it tends to favor Republicans. There's more Republican states, so therefore the Senate where each state gets an equal amount of representation in the Senate, regardless of population, the Senate benefits Republicans, and they have historically benefited off of the Senate. Um, Not to say obviously that Democrats can't win the Senate, it's just a little bit harder for them. They're at a little bit of a disadvantage. Same for the presidency. Trump, of course, did win the popular vote in the last election, um, but he didn't in 2016. The way that the Electoral College is set up is that it does usually go with the popular majority. Um, Usually, if you win the popular vote, you win the Electoral College, but it is very possible that if you get a minority of the vote, you will win the Electoral College, something that has historically benefited Republicans. So, what I'm getting at with all this is that is that Republicans have more of an interest in voter disenfranchisement than Democrats do. Don't get me wrong, Congress as a whole would probably like to see more people, be disenfranchised. Um, but Republicans especially have a vested interest in disenfranchising people. Um, and that's kind of what's going on right now. You guys might have heard about the Save America Act, in which there are now more rules for voting, um, trying to combat election fraud. That's what they say, at least. Um, Again, like I've said, voter fraud is exceptionally rare in this country. And, we can go over statistics. We can go over all this proof on why voter fraud doesn't really happen. In the end, though, it doesn't matter. It's never mattered. The 2020 election, for instance, there was very little evidence of voter fraud that happened. Again, like I said, where hundreds of millions of people vote, there are going to be people that slip through the cracks, but they still pinned on it. You know what I mean? No matter how many facts, no matter how many statistics you brought up, the Republicans kept pushing the narrative. Trump kept pushing the narrative, of course, and people that followed them kept not listening to any sort of counter argument. Because the point is, with all this stirring up worrying about voter fraud, like I said, is to keep people from voting. And that is going to be the consequence of this new Save America Act. Less people are going to vote. Um, Less people in general, less people who can vote, less people who should be eligible to vote under current laws will vote. It's going to make it harder to vote, which means that less people are going to vote. One of the issues that we had in the 2024 election, especially on the Democrat side, was getting people to go out and vote. I want to make it clear that a big part of that was Democrats' fault. People were not inspired to go vote for Harris. Um, Democrats really screwed up the last election. So, not as many people voted. People were less inspired to vote. We have an issue in this country where people just don't vote. A lot of people in this country don't vote. Um, that comes from there's a lot of people who say, I don't care about politics, so they don't go out and vote. There are people who just, don't like either side, so they don't go out and vote. We have an issue in this country where people do not vote. Our voter participation rate is not very good. Let's go ahead and look up what is US voter participation rate. Voter turnout in 2020 and 2024 elections. Yeah. So, I mean, presidential elections, people usually come out to vote. It's pretty cool. It's good stuff. In 2020, about 66% of eligible voters went out to vote. Um, 2024, it was 64%. Did I say 66 for 2020? Because that's the stat I'm looking at right now. This is from Pew Research, by the way, for anyone curious. Um, Midterm elections, the ones every 2 years that determines the House every 2 years and determines a third of the Senate every 2 years, much lower than presidential elections. There was a peak in 2018, which was after, Trump won his first term, at 50%. That's right, 50% of eligible voters voted in the midterms. Even after Trump's first term, when people were super against Trump, when people were inspired to try and flip Congress against Trump because of everything that he was doing, only half of eligible voters came out to vote. That same rate, just 4 years later for the 2022 midterms, just 46%. 46, less than half of eligible voters went out to vote in that midterm election. Um, Historically, it's pretty darn low, sitting at about the what looks to be in the 30s, honestly, 20, 40, so around 40%, 60, 80, unless it's 25. Not too sure how that works, but let's just say 40% looks to be what I'm looking at. Um, Presidential elections are higher, usually over 50 to 60% of voters go out to vote in presidential elections, but those are all eligible voters. These are eligible voters, not the population. These are people who can vote and I think are also registered to vote as well. Um, is this just eligible? Let's see. Not too sure, not too sure. But either way, of eligible voters, that should be higher. Even in 2020, 66%, we could have done better than that. We could have done better than that. We just have a lot of people in this country who don't vote. Simply put, we need to make it easier for these people to vote. If you were to ask me, honestly, I would make it mandatory to vote. You get fined if you don't vote, if it were up to me. If you want to vote for a third party, I think you're wasting your vote, but so be it. At least you're voting. Don't vote third party, guys. Don't vote third party. But I think it should be mandatory to vote. We need more people to vote. That's not happening right now, and it's not going to happen in the future with this new law. That seems like it's going to pass. That seems like it's going to pass. It just passed the House. It's going to the Senate. It's a bit more of a rocky battle in the Senate. They need to get some Democrats over on their side. Um, so let's hope that no Democrats go over to their side. Let's hope, but the Democrats have not been exactly an effective opposition party to everything going on right now. Um, yeah, they're doing this. So let's talk about a little bit more about what's going on in this bill, the Save America Act. Um, just passed the House, like I said. And as I'm sure you guys have gotten, it makes it a little bit harder to vote by requiring certain forms of identification to vote. So in order to register, you are going to so this is just registering to vote. You are going to need a US passport or your birth certificate. Simply put, you would need either your passport or your birth certificate to register to vote. Um, I've registered to vote. I did not need those things. Um, I think I have a passport, but it's very possible that it's been expired at this point. Um, I'm sure I could find my birth certificate if I looked, but it would take a lot of looking and a lot of digging to find that birth certificate in the case that I do not have a passport. Um, yeah, that's going to be a little bit harder to do. Do you know where your passport is? Do you know where your birth certificate is? Um, if you don't, you're going to have to go through a lengthy process to get those back. You might need to go get a passport, which does it cost money to get your passport? Money to get a passport. It's been so long. I was a kid when I got my passport. Oh my gosh. $130 to get your passport. Luckily, your birth certificate is free, but if you don't know where it is, you either have to go through a lengthy process to get that back. Um, where you prove that you're the person that you are, or you can pay $130 to get your passport. Like I said, these are gonna make it really it's just gonna make it a lot harder to vote, essentially. The birth certificate thing especially is like, yeah, you should have your birth certificate. I get that. There's arguments of you should know where your birth certificate is. You should have access to these documents and stuff. And I agree with that to a certain extent, right? You should know where these documents are. I don't think you not knowing where these documents are should determine whether or not you can vote, though. That is going to either just make it so that people will not vote, or where they have to go through this long process if they want to vote. And again, like I just said, where we in this country have a problem where people just don't vote. You know what I mean? Even in presidential elections, especially in the midterms, which I would argue, are more important. Um, with our voter participation rate being so low, these hurdles are going to make it where I'm sure a lot of people are going to be like, it's just not worth it. It is just not worth it, excuse me, for me to go out and vote. That's what's going on right now. It's going to make it's going to make it harder. A lot of people I think are not going to go out and vote. Um they're not going to register because they don't know where their birth certificate is. They don't want to, let's see, process of replacing your birth certificate. Let's look into that right now. Let's see. Um, let's see. Let's see. Mail service. Okay. So maybe it's not quite as hard as I'm thinking it is. Um, let's see. Can I just get like a step by step? There's Google's AI, of course, but I don't want to trust that. How to get a certified copy of a US birth certificate. Contact your birth state or territory to find out. Um, fast. Let's see. How to get a copy. So yeah, you got to get in contact, and you have to get in contact with the looks like the state that you were born in. You can do this online. So it looks like you can get it relatively quickly. It's not as long as a process as I thought. It would be nice to know what you need to do that with. Let's see here. Let's see here. I am going to do a mock applying to get my birth certificate. Um, this is, by the way, I'm doing this on a county website where I was not born in, so it may be very different for you. So let's see. My birth certificate. Let's see. This should be a fun one. We're seeing. This is where I'm kind of glad you guys cannot see my screen, so I'm not doxing myself. Very good stuff. Oh my gosh. Let's see here, guys. Is information, use the correct type of birth certificate that is issued. This information will be used to let's see. Let's just say it's for a social security card. Okie dokie. So, looks like, okay, so looks like I was exaggerating a bit on the difficulty of obtaining a birth certificate. You can order it online. I'm going through this with a county here in the state to which I reside. Um, so this seems legit. I will be honest. It's not quite as hard to get it as I thought it was. Um, that being said, I still don't think my argument is void. I just went through the process here online of doing that. So in that little bit of time between when I said I would start and when I was going to do it, I was able to get it filled out. So it's not quite as bad as I thought it was going to be. I don't know how long it takes to ship. I don't know how long it takes to get approved. So all that being said, maybe it will take longer, maybe it will take shorter. So it's not like the lengthy process that I thought it was. I thought for some reason it was a super lengthy process. That being said, that being said, I don't think you should have to pay money to vote. This is something I feel very strongly about. Like with the passport to be able to vote, you need to pay $130. That's insane. Okay, next option. Bring in your birth certificate to register to vote, which is another part of this law. Like I said, in order to register to vote, you either need your passport or your birth certificate proving that you're a US citizen. I just went through all the checks and stuff, right? This website wants me to pay $41 to get my birth certificate. $41. Now, $41, some say, you know, isn't an insane amount of money. It's not $130, but that's still $41 that you need to pay just to get your birth certificate if you lost it and be able to vote. I do not believe there should be any sort of financial barriers to voting. Even if it is $1, even if it is 1 cent, I do not think that there should be a how do I say it? I do not think that there should be a I do not think there should be any sort of financial barrier to voting. $41 or even $30 in person is not an insignificant amount of money. That is still money that a lot of people need to pay to register to vote. That is a barrier. Simply put, I don't know if this ordered online birth certificate is okay either. You might need to go in person, so that adds a whole other thing where it looks like you need proof of your identity and stuff, because I didn't really need to prove my identity for that online one the more I'm thinking about it. Like I gave them my birth date, where I was born, all that kind of fun stuff. So they might need one of these in-person ones that have to do more. But let's say it's the easiest, just for the sake of argument. The easiest, you can order it online, get it mailed to you for $40. That's still $40 that people need to pay to vote. And simply put, for a lot of people, for a non insignificant amount of people, $40 is not an amount of money that A, they can just spend willy nilly, or that they're willing to pay to vote. Now, obviously, I think voting is very important, and I would say it is worth $40. But at the end of the day, I think voting should be free. Voting is your right. Voting is your right. Poll workers and stuff should be paid by a tax money and stuff, so it's not free to vote in the sense of that it costs zero money. Your tax dollars help pay for it. But voting is your right. Voting is your right. In a democracy, you have the right to participate in the political process. That includes going to protests, that includes yapping into the void if your name is Evan and having nobody really listen to you. Voting is your right, and it is something that you should really, really not have to pay for. There should be little barriers to voting. Yes, maybe you need to show them your driver's license or something when you register to vote. I don't even think I needed to do that, to be honest. When I registered, it's been a minute since I registered to vote. I've been registered to vote for a long time now, but there should not be any financial barriers to register, and especially a $40 to $130 barrier to entry. It is important to note that any sort of complication, any sort of like more roadblocks makes it so that less people will vote. Whether that be, um, people just not wanting to vote, or that they can't vote, or that maybe they cannot spare $40. They have other things that they might need to spend $40 on. You know what I mean? Um, there are people living paycheck to paycheck. They might not see that $40 as worth it to spend. You know what I mean? Especially when there are other things that stop people from voting. You know what I mean? Like there might be one polling station for 50,000 people. So not only is it hard to get out to a polling station to vote, it's also like add on this financial penalty just to register to vote. And you're starting to see that it's becoming harder and harder to vote, meaning less and less people are going to vote. I know I keep reinforcing that idea, but I really wanted to get through everybody's head that if you make it harder to vote, even a little bit, less people are going to vote. Voter fraud is not an issue in this country. Obviously, some people slip through the cracks. There's 100 million votes, like I said, obviously. But even making it a little bit harder to vote means less people are going to vote. And Republicans know this. This is why you see one polling station for 50,000 people, for like, a ton of people. That might be an exaggeration, but it's not. It's not. There's been examples of that. But it is to make it harder to vote without technically disenfranchising people in an illegal way. Um, for instance, in the past, after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were ratified in the Constitution, people of all races, men of all races, I should say, it would take a while for women to get the right to vote, had the right to vote. Simply put, they had the right to vote. You could not, in the past, discriminate based on race for voting, at least. The Supreme Court said it was okay for separate but equal, all that kind of stuff. But in this country, ever since after the Civil War, ever since Reconstruction, it has been illegal to discriminate in voting, at least. Everyone of all races, if you were a man, took until the 19th Amendment for women to get the right to vote. But at least for discrimination based on race, it has been illegal since post Civil War. So people had to get clever with disenfranchising. And the way that they did it was making it harder to vote. Poll taxes. You had to pay money to go vote, meaning that you had to be able to spare money to go vote. That's kind of what we're seeing. You got to pay all this money to get your birth certificate, to get a passport or something. And while it's, a one-time registration fee, can't it's still going to create a barrier to entry for being able to vote. Stuff like literacy tests, all this kind of stuff. They were not technically violating the Constitution because everybody had to pay the poll tax. Um, nearly everyone. There was like certain time, there were, of course, people that they would give the literacy test to more than others. But a literacy test on its own and a poll tax on its own did not violate the Constitution. They were not explicitly there to discriminate. But they did essentially put them there to explicitly discriminate without writing it into law. They knew the consequences of these poll taxes. They knew the consequences of these literacy tests, and they worked. They disenfranchised millions of people for decades until it was made illegal to do poll taxes and literacy tests later down the line in the 60s. So, making it harder to vote. And the way you make it harder to vote, A, making it harder to vote just in general, means less people are going to vote because you created more of a barrier, simply put. But stuff like this also obviously will affect some people more than others. People that cannot really afford to spare $40 to reobtain their birth certificate. People who cannot afford to spare, $130 to get their, oh my gosh, their passport. People who cannot afford to take time out of their day to go down and obtain a birth certificate in person. I again need to do more research to see if you can just mail order your birth certificate or you need to go to an office and get a copy in person. Even if we assume that you can get it mailed, it is still an amount of money that certain people will just not be able to afford. The poorest among us, people who, you know, just are living to paycheck. And yeah, this will have the effect of disenfranchising people. This will have the effect. And the people that it disenfranchises will usually not be middle class white voters. Sure, less middle class white voters are going to vote because, again, you're adding all these barriers. So there's just going to be people who are like, it's just not worth voting. But the people who will be affected by this the most are poor, people of color, and those are the people that, Republicans especially don't want to vote because they are usually the demographics that they lose with. So, yeah, those are just the barriers to register. For actually voting, for voting at the poll station, everything that I just went over was just to vote at a poll station. You still do need an ID now. You need an ID to vote at a poll station. So, even if you're registered to vote, right? Even if you went through all these hoops to register to vote, right? You need to how do I say it? You will also need to show ID at the polling station. It's been a long time since I voted in person. I don't think I've actually ever voted in person now I think about it. I think I've only voted via the mail. And I remember seeing something about you're going to need to prove ID voting via mail as well. Let me see. Um, I'd have to double check on that. I could have sworn I saw something about some more hoops about needing to about voting via mail. Um, so I'll double check on that. Maybe make an effort. Let me see. Say America Act. Sorry, guys. Just want to make sure I have the right information for you. And I will get it for you as soon as I can. But even after you've registered to vote, you will still need to show ID once you get to the polling station. Um, this new bill that was passed does seem to have expanded the valid forms of ID. Um, that you can show at the polling station. For instance, you can now show your driver's license and an ID card that was not valid in the original form of this bill. They did amend the bill probably to make it a little bit more palatable that your driver's license is a valid form of ID. So here are the valid forms of ID that you can show when you go to vote. One is a driver's license, like I said, a state issued ID card, your passport, a military ID card, and a tribal government ID card. So these are all valid forms of ID that you can go ahead and use when you go to the polling station to vote. So yeah, not only do you need these more complicated forms of ID when you go to vote, but also you are going to need it. Sorry, you need these more complicated forms of ID, your birth certificate and a passport when you register to vote. But you also need ID when you go to vote too. So even if you went through, you got your birth certificate or you got your passport, to register to vote, you're going to need at least the passport again, or a driver's license, or an ID card in order to vote. Now, some might say, Evan, Evan, everybody has a driver's license, don't they? No. First off, no, they don't. There are millions of people without a driver's license because A, there are millions of people who do not have a card, or sorry, a car. So they don't have a driver's license, or maybe not. Um, it also costs money to get a driver's license and an ID card. Again, all these things cost money. They're not free. They're not free. Let's see, cost to get just a government ID. Like $40. $40 just for an ID card. Like this is not an insignificant amount of money. Like if I drop $40, like that's something I need to think about. That's like, okay, that's $40. It's not, once you're getting above $10, it's like, oh gosh, am I spending this much money? But $40 is not an insignificant amount of money. And that's the thing. I do think you need an ID to register to vote, no matter what. So that's already there. But you got to have all these when you go to vote as well. So if it expired, you need to get your ID again, or you're kind of out of luck. You don't get to vote. I want to see, sorry guys, I just want to see how this affects mail-in voting. How this sort of ID laws will affect mail-in voting. Because I feel like it's going to make it so much harder. Let me see. This is talking about like some practical effects of mail-in voting. Mail. Come on. Why does it not say anything? Do you still need these IDs for mail-in voting? Because if so, how are they going to like, do you mail in your ID? Do you scan a copy in of your ID? Sorry guys, I'm not seeing anything on mail-in voting. Let me see. I don't want to spend too much time. Let's see. So this says the vote is also meant to satisfy the president's demand for a voter crackdown as he mulls bigger overhaul many pose. So he wants to end mail-in voting. Okay. Yeah, it's just, so even if you mail in your vote, do you need an ID? Yeah, That's an interesting thing. I'd have to do more research on that. So maybe during a stream or something, I'll update everybody. Um, but yeah, guys, yeah, that is what's going on. And another point that I forgot to make was that in the Constitution, elections are left up to the state. Like states decide whether or not you need these IDs or not, or whether or not you can just go in, vote, shave your beard, vote again, all that kind of fun stuff. Um, Constitutionally, states have the power to, control elections. And that is just kind of being called into question right now. Like these are federal. This is going to apply to elections all across the country. You know what I mean? At least for the federal elections, voting for the House and stuff. But even still, states control elections. That's what the Constitution says. Um, the reason why certain laws can be passed, like against poll taxes and stuff, is because the federal government, has the power to make sure everybody is being treated equally before the law. So if your state law, violates that, federal law trounces it. But if not, then, the federal government can't do too much. And they're doing quite a lot right now. So it's going to be interesting to see how this goes down in the courts, even, or if that even really matters. But yeah, that's that, everybody. Um, that's the main story for today, I would say. Um, we will probably end it there, I think. There's some more news that I want to talk about, but if I'm being quite honest, my voice is starting to give out. It's getting harder for me to talk. So I think I will just upload this. You know, this will be the main story we talk about, and hopefully we will see you all next morning. Or you know what? You know what? This is an important news story. I need to get over myself. I'm gonna keep on talking for a little bit. Might not spend quite as much time on this, but it's an important news story, so you guys need to hear about it. Recently, so a long time ago, 2009 to be exact, um, in 2009, there was what is the decision called exactly? Oh my gosh, why can I not find what it was called? I literally just had the name of it in me. I cannot remember what this is called. But anyway, in 2009, um, the EPA, publicly found that, it's been known for a while, but in 2009, the EPA basically said, guys, listen, carbon dioxide, methane, these gases are warming the planet, and these are not great. Warming the planet is not that good. So therefore, we pretty much have the right to regulate, you know, um, to regulate emissions. We have the right as the EPA to regulate them under stuff like the Clean Air Act, which was passed well before 2009, right? So that's kind of been that decision has been like the linchpin of being able to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, putting regulations on cars, putting regulations on factories, putting basically saying you need to do more to cut down on your greenhouse gas emissions. Um, the US already doesn't do a lot in that category. The United States is per capita. Let me see actually. I know I'm right on this, but I think it's good to have some numbers. Per capita greenhouse gas emissions by country. So this is per capita, right? This is per capita greenhouse gas emissions. The United States has gone down. We've done good. Guys, we've done good. one of the biggest decreases have been since 2009, may I say. Geez, I wonder why. But per capita, meaning per person greenhouse gas emissions, has gone down quite a bit since our peak in the 2000s. The United States' per capita greenhouse gas emissions is 14.8 tons of CO2 per person per year. That is in the United States. Canada is a close second. Um, but our friends over in the EU, again, these are developed countries, and even in the UK, they're at 6.49 tons of CO2 per person. Again, this is how much CO2 one person consumes, essentially, or essentially emits, I guess. You don't consume the CO2, but through your energy use, on average, Americans emit 14.2 tons, while people in the EU, you know, also emit six point roughly 6 tons of CO2 per person. That's a big difference. That's a huge difference. Again, in a lot of other countries, countries that are still developing, their CO2 emissions per capita tend to be lower just because they do not have access to the technology that we do, and so they emit less. There's a large correlation between energy use and wealth, simply put. Um, Even in countries like China, whose energy use per capita has been increasing over time, it's still quite a bit less per capita. Per capita, China's at about 8.5 tons per person. We're at around 14.32. The United States, Canada is also in this, so, Canadians, you're not off the hook either, but I live in the US, so I'm focusing on the US. So the US already, emits quite a bit per person. Um, a lot of that comes from, the fact we live in a very car-centric society. It's probably also one of the reasons Canada emits so much per person. Um, but also just Americans do tend to get their energy, uh, you know, based on non-clean ways. And it's been going down in recent years. It really has. We have done a lot from our peak in 2001, it looks like, of about 20. We've gone down quite a bit. We really have gone down quite a bit. So I don't want to say it's all bad. But part of that is regulations. A big part of that is the ability of the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The Trump administration is basically trying to overturn that. They're going to repeal that conclusion, and get rid of the legal framework for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Um, and guys, as we know, the climate's going to get worse over time. It really is. We haven't talked about it in a while because so much has been going on, especially here in the United States, just with everyday politics, that the existential threat that is climate change has kind of been put on the back burner. People don't talk about it as much, but it's obviously still a massive issue, huge. Um, that is now gonna be even worse. I mean, we the first Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. Biden brought us back. Then Trump was like, yoink, takes us back out. All of this is just going to obviously make it harder to regulate and just lead to more pollution, a lot more pollution. I don't necessarily know if it will go back to our peak or maybe higher. Um, there are certain market influences that have also brought down emissions. I don't want to necessarily say there haven't been. Technology has improved, so efficiency has been improving as well. There's been more renewables growing in general. Um, so I don't think we'll get back to our peak. At least I hope not. There's an optimistic part of me there. Um, but technology and markets on their own won't fix the climate crisis. Simply put, we need heavy handed regulation. And I mean heavy handed regulation. Sure, over time, people want to be more efficient. They don't want to just spend a ton of money on, oil and all that. But there's only so much that they'd be willing to do. We need heavy handed regulations. And this is gutting our ability to regulate. It means that Congress would have to pass individual regulation laws, um, which is going to be, I'll just say it, not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's not just unlikely, it is not going to happen. You are not going to see Congress come in and start to regulate. Simply put, that's not going to happen. Congress is deadlocked, maybe at a time when Democrats might own the House and the Senate. But even Democrats don't do a ton to help with regulations. Biden's Build Back Better has basically been gutted. Um, I mean, last year I saw a ton of like videos about people who had voted for Trump who had personally benefited from Biden's policies, now mad at Trump. And I was like, well, you did that to yourself. But um, yeah, basically gutting the EPA's ability to regulate means that does not mean that there will never be another regulation again. It just means that Congress has to regulate. Congress has to pass specific regulations, which is going to make it so that less regulations happen. Simply put, um, one of the points of bureaucracy and letting bureaucrats make these regulatory decisions is because so much goes on in this country that Congress literally cannot pass every individual law to deal with every individual regulation. Like that's just too much. That is just too much. Some might say, and I really do understand where they are coming from, that you should that Congress should pass these laws, that it should be up to democratically elected representatives to pass these laws. And I really do understand where they're coming from. I don't want to say that I don't. I believe in democracy. I love democracy. Um, but it's just impractical to have Congress pass all these specific regulations, whether that be consumer protection regulations, um, dealing with, like the FTC and everything. Um, all these bureaucratic agencies pass nitty gritty regulations because Congress just can't. They have too much on their plate. And if they did have to do that, that's where you get these mega bills with horrible things that are hidden within them. You know what I mean? Like when the Republicans, in order to keep the government running, pass have this whole funding bill where hidden within it is the "we will come to your house and kill you" part of the bill, and you either pass the whole thing or the government shuts down. So they're trying to tie your hands so you pass the "we will kill you" part of the bill. Um, yeah, having to do this will probably make those bills a lot more common. Um, and like I said, just practically, Congress cannot regulate everything. These bureaucratic agencies, Congress passes a bill that says the EPA exists and that they can work within the bounds given to them to regulate. You know what I mean? The courts and Congress can still come in and say, you have overstepped your boundaries. And they do this quite a bit, right? But when it comes to the nitty gritty, these agencies have the power to regulate simply because it is impractical, especially in a country as big as the United States, for Congress to pass all these individual regulations. So Congress can still regulate, pass these individual regulations, but it's going to be a lot harder. We see that Congress gets like nothing done So I don't have a ton of hope that they will pass regulations. So this new, basically the EPA repealing its own decision will mean that a lot more pollutants are released into the atmosphere. It means, pollutants that are harmful to people's individual health, you know, will be released more because, regulations at the end of the day do make it more expensive to conduct business. Now, there will probably be a decent amount of inertia to some of these regulations. Um, what I mean by that is that a lot of companies have already put in a lot of money into these regulations, so they won't go away immediately, right? It's not like this decision gets repealed and suddenly all the factories that are already there, they're removing their CO2 filters and they're like, yeah, just keep pump CO2 into the atmosphere, pump it into people's lungs. Come here buddy, we're gonna fill your lungs with CO2 and you're gonna love it. um that's not what's gonna happen. There's probably gonna be some inertia to what is already in place, but in the long run, when you have to replace machine parts, when you build another factory, whatever it might be, they are not going to be as efficient, and you will see more pollutants released into the atmosphere. The climate will continue to change, and it will continue to change at an accelerating rate. Um, Already, like I said, the US does not do, it is not just nearly enough for the environment, but it is kind of next to nothing. We are per capita the largest polluter on the planet. Um, and we're making it so that that will probably rise again. Um, yeah, sorry to end on such a downer, but it's been about an hour. I think that's a good place to stop for an episode. Um, yeah, thank you so much for listening if you got through this whole thing. If not, that's okay too. But I'm gonna try and do this every morning where I wake up and I just start yapping to you guys. Um, and I'm gonna post it. Um, Probably with no background, really. This is just for you guys to listen to. Um, and yeah, it will be unedited. I'm actually gonna go post this right now. I hope you all have a wonderful morning. We will see you guys either on the next stream or hopefully tomorrow morning. We'll see how well I commit to that. You all have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for tuning in. Bye bye.